The Fire Ant General of Texas. The enslaved woman who bred 3 million fire ants and unleashed them at a wedding, 1857. 3 million fire ants, each carrying venom capable of causing excruciating pain, anaphylactic shock, and death in allergic victims, swarmed across the white linen tablecloths of the grandest wedding reception Texas had ever seen. The date was June 14th, 1857. The location was Thornwood Plantation in Robertson County, Texas, where 340 guests in their finest silk gowns and tailored suits had gathered to celebrate the marriage of Sarah Thornwood, daughter of Master Robert Thornwood, to plantation heir William Blackstone. At exactly 3:47 p.m., as the wedding toast was being made, the ants arrived. Within 90 seconds, elegant celebration became absolute chaos. Fire ants covered tables, chairs, guests. They climbed up table legs, swarmed across food, crawled inside clothing, bit exposed skin repeatedly. 340 guests received an estimated 50,000 to 100,000 stings in 5 minutes. 23 required hospitalization. 4 elderly guests died from anaphylactic shock. The bride was stung 143 times and scarred for life. The groom lost sight in his left eye. The wedding feast was completely destroyed. But the fire ants didn't arrive by chance. They were bred, cultivated, and directed over 14 months by an enslaved woman named Hannah Freeman, age 26, who worked as the plantation's herb gardener and beehive assistant. And the wedding she tried to destroy was not random. Robert Thornwood, father of the bride, was the man who had beaten Hannah's mother Rebecca to death 7 months earlier for protecting Hannah's younger brother Isaac, then sold Isaac to Mississippi, where he died within weeks. Hannah Freeman had lost her entire family in a single month. And as she stood in the woods 600 yards away on the afternoon of June 14th, 1857, watching the wedding reception descend into chaos, she felt neither triumph nor satisfaction, because her plan was failing. The ants weren't coordinated as she'd calculated. They were attacking randomly, hitting innocent people, children, elderly guests who'd done nothing wrong. And she realized with growing horror that she'd become exactly what she'd sworn to destroy. Someone willing to cause mass suffering to satisfy personal vengeance. What Hannah Freeman didn't know as she watched the chaos unfold was that in 47 minutes, she would be discovered. In 93 minutes, she would be arrested. And in the weeks that followed, she would face a choice that would define whether revenge was justice or just another cycle of violence. This is not a story about perfect revenge executed flawlessly. This is a story about what happens when a brilliant plan goes wrong, when the cost of vengeance becomes too high, and when an enslaved woman discovers that some prices aren't worth paying even for justice. Hannah Freeman was born in 1831 on Thornwood Plantation, daughter of Tobias Freeman, beekeeper, and Rebecca Freeman, seamstress. Unlike most enslaved children who received no education, Hannah learned from her father, who taught her about insects, plants, and natural systems. By age 12, she could identify every plant species on the plantation. By 15, she understood insect behavior better than most naturalists. By 18, she was assisting her father with beehive management and had developed her own herb garden that the plantation relied on for medicines. Hannah had a younger brother, Isaac, born in 1848 when she was 17. She helped raise him, taught him letters secretly, protected him as much as an enslaved older sister could protect anyone. For 8 years, 1848-1856, their small family existed in the precarious stability slavery allowed, always aware everything could be destroyed instantly, but hoping somehow it wouldn't be. November 17th, 1856, shattered that hope. Isaac, age 8, took a piece of cornbread from a kitchen windowsill because he was hungry. The cook reported him. Master Thornwood came with his whip. Rebecca threw herself between the whip and her son. Thornwood beat her instead, 27 lashes and kicks that caused fatal internal injuries. She died at 4:43 p.m. The next day, Thornwood sold Isaac to a Mississippi cotton plantation notorious for killing children through overwork. Hannah watched her mother die. She watched her brother sold away. She watched her father Tobias collapse into grief so profound he stopped functioning. And she felt something crystallize inside her, cold rage that demanded action. But Hannah understood something her father didn't. Direct revenge would get her killed and accomplish nothing. She needed to be smarter, more patient, more strategic. Over the next month, December 1856, Hannah developed a plan that was both brilliant and terrifying. She would weaponize fire ants, breed them in massive numbers, and release them at Robert Thornwood's daughter's wedding in June 1857. The wedding was scheduled months in advance, giving Hannah time to prepare. But unlike simple revenge fantasies, Hannah's plan had a fatal flaw she wouldn't recognize until too late. She couldn't control where the ants would go once released. She could direct them toward the reception tent, but she couldn't make them only attack Robert Thornwood. They would attack everyone, including innocent people, including children. Hannah spent January-May 1857 implementing her plan with meticulous care. She collected 23 fire ant queens during spring mating flights. She established them in artificial mounds in remote woodland areas. She fed and managed them as they built colonies totaling approximately 2 million ants. She identified 5 natural colonies containing another 1.5 million ants. She studied pheromone communication, learning how to extract and concentrate trail chemicals. She created training patterns, teaching colonies to follow scent trails toward specific locations. The work was technically sophisticated, demonstrating Hannah's exceptional intelligence. She created pheromone extracts by crushing thousands of ants and dissolving their venom glands in alcohol. She marked trails from colony sites toward the wedding reception area. She placed food sources along trails to reinforce the routes. She planned to disturb all colonies simultaneously on June 14th, triggering mass mobilization toward pheromone markers she'd placed at the reception tent. But Hannah made critical mistakes rooted in grief and rage, clouding her judgment. Mistake 1. She never tested the full system. She trained individual colonies, but never disturbed all 23 colonies simultaneously to see how they'd interact. She assumed they'd follow pheromone trails in coordinated fashion. She didn't account for territorial conflicts, wind direction changing trail strength, or random ant behavior at scale. Mistake 2. She didn't consider innocent victims. Her focus was so fixed on destroying Thornwood's happiness that she didn't fully process that 340 wedding guests would include children, elderly people with heart conditions, pregnant women, servants who were themselves enslaved. She knew intellectually that others would be hurt, but she suppressed that knowledge in service of revenge. Mistake 3. She didn't plan escape. She was so focused on execution that she didn't think through what would happen after. Where would she go? How would she avoid suspicion? What would happen to her father Tobias if she was caught? These mistakes would cost her everything. June 14th, 1857 arrived. Hannah executed her plan perfectly from a technical standpoint. At 3:00 p.m., she disturbed all 23 fire ant colonies. At 3:37 p.m., the first ants reached the reception tent. At 3:47 p.m., millions of ants swarmed the reception, causing exactly the chaos she'd planned. But then Hannah saw the reality of what she'd done. She saw Caroline Whitfield, age 71, trampled and dying from anaphylactic shock. Caroline had no connection to Rebecca's death. She was just an elderly woman attending a wedding. She saw Judge Marcus Rutherford, age 68, having a heart attack from the stress and pain. Rutherford had sentenced escaped enslaved people to death, yes, but he was also dying in agony surrounded by ants. And Hannah realized watching someone die horribly wasn't the justice she'd imagined. She saw children screaming, covered in ants, traumatized in ways they'd never fully recover from. Children who had done nothing wrong except be born into families that owned enslaved people. She saw the bride, Sarah Thornwood, who Hannah had actually spoken to occasionally and who'd always been relatively kind, stung 143 times, scarred permanently, her wedding day destroyed. Sarah wasn't responsible for Rebecca's death. She'd probably never even known about it. And Hannah saw enslaved people, cooks, servers, musicians, also being attacked by ants because Hannah's plan couldn't distinguish between oppressor and oppressed. The ants attacked everyone equally. At 4:34 p.m., 47 minutes after the ants arrived, Hannah broke. She ran from her hiding spot in the woods toward the reception area, screaming, "Stop! Someone stop them! I didn't mean for this." She was crying, horrified, trying to help people despite knowing it would expose her. She reached the tent at 4:38 p.m. and began helping injured guests, brushing ants off children, trying to explain to confused overseers where the ant colonies were located so they could be destroyed. She wasn't thinking strategically anymore. She was thinking like a healer, like someone who couldn't bear watching mass suffering she'd caused. At 5:10 p.m., 1 hour and 23 minutes after the attack began, plantation overseer James Crawford grabbed Hannah and demanded, "How do you know where the colonies are? Why are you so specific about locations?" Hannah, exhausted and emotionally devastated, told the truth. She confessed everything. The 14 months of preparation, the queen collection, the pheromone manipulation, the deliberate targeting of the wedding. All of it. She was arrested immediately, chained, thrown into the plantation's holding cell. Robert Thornwood, standing over his daughter's injured body, demanded Hannah be hanged immediately. But Texas law in 1857, despite its brutality toward enslaved people, still required some form of trial even for enslaved defendants accused of major crimes. Hannah would face trial in 3 weeks. Those 3 weeks in the holding cell fundamentally changed Hannah. She had constant time to think about what she'd done, to process the gap between her revenge fantasy and its reality. She'd imagined feeling satisfied watching Thornwood suffer. Instead, she felt horrified watching 4 innocent people die and hundreds suffer. She'd imagined her mother and brother would be avenged. Instead, she'd become a mass murderer who'd attacked indiscriminately. Her father Tobias visited her twice before the trial. Their conversations were brief but profound. First visit, June 18th. Tobias was destroyed. "Hannah, why? Why would you do this? Your mother wouldn't have wanted this. Isaac wouldn't have wanted this." "I wanted them to pay," Hannah said through tears. "I wanted Thornwood to feel what you felt, what I felt. Loss, pain, destroyed happiness. And now? Do you feel better? Did it work?" "No," Hannah whispered. "It just made more death, more pain, and it didn't bring them back." Second visit, June 29th, 4 days before trial. Tobias brought devastating news. "Isaac is dead. Got word today. He died 2 months ago in Mississippi. Fever. They buried him in an unmarked grave." Hannah broke completely. Her brother, the child she'd tried to avenge, had been dead since April. Her entire revenge campaign, all the preparation, all the violence, all the suffering she'd caused. Isaac had already been dead for 2 months before she'd executed it. The revenge was pointless, meaningless. Her mother was dead. Her brother was dead. And she'd killed 4 people and injured hundreds trying to balance scales that could never be balanced. I killed people trying to avenge someone who was already dead, she said. I became exactly what I hated. Someone who hurts innocent people for their own purposes. The trial occurred July 3rd, 1857, in Robertson County Courthouse. It lasted 4 hours. Hannah pled guilty, refused to mount any defense, and asked for death penalty. The all-white jury deliberated 17 minutes and returned guilty verdict on charges of destruction of property, assault, and manslaughter, the 4 deaths. Though Texas law didn't recognize killing enslaved people as murder, even when they died as collateral damage. The judge, Richard Morrison, did something unusual. Instead of immediate sentencing, he asked Hannah directly, "Do you understand what you did? Do you feel remorse?" "Yes," Hannah said clearly. "I understand I killed people who didn't deserve to die. I hurt children. I caused suffering to take revenge for suffering. I became what I hated. If I could undo it, I would. But I can't. So I'm ready to die." Morrison paused. "Under Texas law, I could have you hanged. Your crime was severe. But I'm also aware that you lost your mother and brother to unjust violence that was never prosecuted. I'm aware that enslaved people have no legal recourse for injustice. And I'm aware that you showed remorse, confessed voluntarily, and tried to help victims despite knowing it would expose you. These factors don't excuse what you did, but they complicate it." He sentenced Hannah to 20 years hard labor rather than execution, with a possibility of freedom if she demonstrated genuine rehabilitation and service to community. This was controversial. Many white community members wanted her hanged. But Morrison's ruling stood. Hannah was transferred to a work farm in central Texas. She spent the next 5 years, 1857, 1862, in brutal labor conditions. But something unexpected happened. She began using her knowledge to help people. She created medicinal herb gardens. She helped injured workers with natural remedies. She taught other enslaved people about plants and healing. When Union forces reached Central Texas in 1862, Hannah walked away a free woman at age 31. She moved to Houston, worked as a herbalist and healer, lived quietly. She married in 1865, had 2 daughters, died in 1903 at age 72. Before she died, she gave one interview to a black newspaper documenting formerly enslaved people's experiences. In it, she said something remarkable. "People ask if I regret what I did in 1857? Yes, completely. I killed people who didn't deserve to die. I hurt innocent people trying to hurt guilty people. Revenge felt justified when I was planning it. But when I saw the reality, children screaming, elderly people dying, random suffering, I understood I'd become what I claimed to oppose. Someone who uses violence against innocence. My mother wouldn't have wanted that wedding destroyed. She'd have wanted me to live, to survive, to help people, to use my knowledge for healing, not harm. Isaac wouldn't have wanted 4 people dead in his name. He was a gentle child who cried when insects died. Revenge doesn't bring justice. It just makes more death. Real justice would have been a world where my mother couldn't be beaten to death, where my brother couldn't be sold and worked to death, where Robert Thornwood faced consequences for his actions. But I couldn't create that world through violence. I just added more violence to a violent system. If I could tell younger people one thing, your rage is justified. The injustice you face is real. But becoming what you hate doesn't fix anything. Find ways to resist that don't destroy your own humanity. Because once you're willing to hurt innocent people for your cause, you've lost what made your cause just. Hannah Freeman's story spread through Texas's black communities, not as triumph, but as cautionary tale. The woman who tried to weaponize nature and discovered that revenge without precision becomes indiscriminate violence. The daughter who learned that avenging the dead by creating more dead accomplishes nothing. The healer who temporarily became a killer and spent the rest of her life trying to heal the wound she'd created in herself. Modern entomologists who study the case note that Hannah's technical execution was brilliant. Her pheromone manipulation and colony management demonstrated sophisticated understanding. But they also note her failure to account for ant behavior at scale and inability to direct attacks precisely. Dr. Sarah Morrison, Texas A&M, wrote in 2012, Freeman's method could have worked for targeted elimination of a single individual in controlled environment. But releasing millions of ants in open space with hundreds of people guarantees collateral damage. Her technical knowledge was exceptional. Her strategic planning was fatally flawed. The moral questions Hannah's story raises are different from typical revenge narratives. She wasn't caught because she made technical mistakes. She was caught because she couldn't bear watching innocent people suffer from her actions. She confessed not because someone forced her, but because she chose honesty over escape. And she spent the rest of her life arguing against the very revenge she'd attempted. Was she a hero? No. She committed mass violence that killed 4 people and injured hundreds, including children. Was she a villain? Not exactly. She was a grieving daughter and sister who made terrible choices driven by justified rage, then had the moral courage to recognize her choices were wrong and spend decades trying to make amends. Her story asks uncomfortable questions. What do we do with justified anger at unjust systems? How do we resist oppression without becoming oppressors? When does revenge stop being justice and become just more violence? And what does it mean to take responsibility for harm you've caused, even when that harm was motivated by harm done to you? Hannah Freeman died in 1903, having spent 46 years healing people, teaching herbalism, and arguing passionately against revenge as solution to injustice. Her gravestone in Houston reads, Hannah Freeman, 1831-1903. Healer, mother, woman who learned that the opposite of violence is not weakness, but wisdom. Remember her name not as someone who successfully executed revenge, but as someone who tried, failed, faced the consequences, and spent her life proving that people can change, that mistakes don't define you, and that sometimes the bravest thing isn't fighting back, but recognizing when fighting back costs more than it achieves. Tobias Freeman was born in 1819 on a cotton plantation near Houston, Texas, son of 2 enslaved people who had been brought from Louisiana during Texas's early settlement period. His father, Marcus, had been a beekeeper before enslavement, someone who understood insect behavior, who knew how to read the natural world, who recognized that insects followed predictable patterns that could be understood and manipulated. Marcus taught Tobias everything he knew before dying from heat stroke in the cotton fields when Tobias was 13. But Marcus's knowledge didn't die with him. Tobias inherited his father's fascination with insects, particularly social insects like bees and ants that operated in coordinated colonies with complex communication systems. By age 15, Tobias could identify every ant species in Texas by sight. By 18, he understood their behavior patterns, nesting preferences, food sources, and communication methods. By 20, he recognized something that few people in 1839 understood. Ants could be influenced, directed, controlled through manipulation of their pheromone communication system. In 1842, at age 23, Tobias was sold to Thornwood Plantation in Robertson County for $850. Robert Thornwood, who was 35 at the time, had recently inherited the 4,000-acre property and 143 enslaved people from his father. Thornwood needed someone who could manage the plantation's beehives, which produced honey for sale and beeswax for candles. He also needed someone who could handle the persistent problem of crop-damaging insects. Tobias's reputation as an insect expert made him valuable. Thornwood gave Tobias unusual responsibilities. He managed 20 beehives, maintained insect traps throughout the property, advised on crop protection, and was consulted whenever pest problems arose. This gave Tobias freedom to roam the plantation grounds, to study the natural environment, to observe without constant supervision. He used this freedom to expand his knowledge, particularly his understanding of fire ants. Fire ants, Solenopsis invicta, are native to South America, but had been spreading across the southern United States through shipping traffic since the 1820s. By the 1840s, they were well established in Texas. Most plantation owners considered them a nuisance, occasionally painful, but not particularly dangerous. Tobias recognized they were far more than nuisances. They were potential weapons. Fire ant colonies can contain 100,000, 500,000 individual ants. They're extraordinarily aggressive when their colony is disturbed, attacking in massive coordinated swarms. Their venom contains alkaloids that cause immediate burning pain, pustule formation, and in allergic individuals, potentially fatal anaphylactic reactions. Multiple stings can trigger shock even in non-allergic people, and most importantly, they follow pheromone trails with remarkable precision, allowing them to be directed toward specific targets if you understand their chemical communication system. In 1848, at age 29, Tobias married Rebecca, an enslaved woman who worked in the Thornwood house as a seamstress. Robert Thornwood allowed the marriage, not from kindness, but from calculation. Married enslaved people were more stable, more productive, less likely to run away. They were granted permission to live together in a cabin Tobias built himself near the beehives, away from the main slave quarters. For 5 years, they had something resembling family life, though always shadowed by the knowledge that it could be destroyed at any moment. In 1850, Rebecca gave birth to Isaac. Tobias held his son and felt terror mixed with joy because he knew that enslaved children increased vulnerability. Love became a weapon masters used against you. But he couldn't help loving Isaac, couldn't help teaching him about bees and ants, couldn't help hoping that somehow his son might have a better future. For 6 years, Isaac grew into a bright, curious child who asked constant questions, who wanted to understand how everything worked, who had inherited both his father's intelligence and his mother's gentle spirit. November 17th, 1856 was a Sunday. The one day enslaved people were sometimes given partial rest. Tobias was working the beehives, Rebecca was mending clothes, Isaac was playing near their cabin. At 2 p.m., Isaac saw a piece of cornbread sitting on a windowsill at the big house kitchen. He was 9 years old, perpetually hungry like all enslaved children who were fed minimal rations. He took the cornbread and ate it. The cook, a white woman named Mrs. Patterson, saw him take it and immediately reported to Master Thornwood. Theft was theft, she said, even if it was just cornbread, even if it was a hungry child. Thornwood came to the quarters carrying his whip, a braided leather weapon that he used frequently to maintain control through terror. He found Isaac near the cabin and grabbed him by the arm, threw him to the ground, raised the whip. Rebecca heard Isaac cry out and ran from the cabin. She saw Thornwood about to strike her son, and every maternal instinct overpowered every survival instinct. She threw herself between them, caught the first lash across her back and screamed. "He's just a child. He was hungry. Please." What happened next was witnessed by 14 enslaved people, who would later testify. Though their testimony was never recorded in official documents, because enslaved people couldn't testify against white people in Texas courts, Thornwood, enraged that Rebecca had interfered, that she had dared to physically block his punishment, began beating her instead. Not controlled punishment, frenzied violence. He struck her repeatedly with the whip, 27 times according to witnesses, targeting her back, shoulders, head. When she fell, he kicked her. When she tried to protect herself, he struck harder. Tobias arrived in the middle of the attack, having heard Rebecca's screams from the beehive area 200 yards away. He saw his wife on the ground being beaten, saw Isaac crying and screaming for his mother, saw Thornwood's rage. Tobias tried to intervene, tried to pull Thornwood away, but 2 white overseers restrained him, held him while the beating continued. Rebecca lost consciousness after the 18th blow. Thornwood struck her 9 more times after she was unconscious. Rebecca was carried to the cabin by enslaved women who tried every remedy they knew: herbs, poultices, prayers. But internal injuries were beyond their ability to treat. She had severe internal bleeding, likely ruptured spleen and liver damage from the kicks. She remained unconscious, breathing shallowly, for 2 hours and 43 minutes. Tobias held her hand, begged her to stay, promised her things would be different, lied to himself that she would survive. Rebecca Freeman died at 4:43 p.m. on November 17, 1856, at age 34. From internal injuries sustained from a whipping and beating administered by Master Robert Thornwood, because she protected her 9-year-old son from punishment for taking a piece of cornbread. Her death was recorded in Thornwood's property ledger as Negro woman Rebecca, age 34, died from injuries sustained during justified punishment for insubordination. Loss value, $800. The hours before Rebecca's death were witnessed by Tobias in excruciating detail. After the beating, he carried her to their cabin, her body limp and broken in his arms. The enslaved women who came to help, old Martha who knew herbs, young Sarah who had nursed sick children, Eliza who had seen death many times, examined Rebecca, and their faces told Tobias everything. The external injuries were severe. 27 lash marks across her back and shoulders, deep bruising, torn skin. But the internal injuries were what would kill her. Rebecca regained consciousness briefly at 3:15 p.m., approximately 45 minutes after the beating stopped. She opened her eyes, saw Tobias holding her hand, tried to speak. "Isaac," she whispered. "Protect Isaac." Tobias promised he would, lied because he had no power to protect anyone. Rebecca tried to smile, failed, closed her eyes. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Blood appeared at the corner of her mouth around 3:45 p.m., indicating internal bleeding. Her skin took on a grayish pallor. Her pulse grew weak and irregular. Old Martha prepared herbs that might ease pain, but couldn't stop internal hemorrhaging. She crushed willow bark for pain, made compresses for the lash wounds, prayed quietly in a language that predated English and slavery. Isaac sat in the corner of the cabin, watching his mother die, understanding it was his fault for taking the cornbread, internalizing guilt that would scar him forever. Tobias held Rebecca's hand and felt it grow cold, felt her pulse fade, felt her slip away into death despite his desperate, silent begging for her to stay. At 4:43 p.m., Rebecca's breathing stopped. Her chest rose one final time, held, then released. She was gone. Tobias sat with her body for 6 hours, holding her hand, talking to her, apologizing for failing to protect her, promising revenge he didn't yet know how to achieve. At 10 p.m., the women came back to prepare her body for burial. They washed her, dressed her in her one good dress, laid her out on the cabin floor with candles at her head and feet. She was buried the next morning in the slave cemetery, an unmarked grave among hundreds of others. Her life reduced to a property ledger entry. But Robert Thornwood wasn't finished. The next morning, November 18th, he summoned Tobias to the main house. Tobias came, numb with grief, exhausted from sitting up all night with Rebecca's body. Thornwood was in his study, sitting behind his mahogany desk, a glass of bourbon beside him, looking calm and satisfied. He gestured to a chair. Tobias remained standing, unable to sit in the presence of the man who'd killed his wife. "About your boy," Thornwood said casually, as if discussing weather. "Isaac. He caused all this unfortunate business. The cornbread theft, your wife's interference, the whole regrettable situation. I've made a decision. He's too much risk to keep here. Demonstrated poor character, bad influence on other children. I've sold him." The words didn't make sense at first. Tobias's exhausted, grief-shattered mind couldn't process them. "Sold him?" "Mississippi. Plantation called Riverside, down in the Delta. They specialize in cotton, need children for lighter field work. I got a good price, $450, considering his age and the trouble he caused. He leaves tomorrow morning." "No." The word came out automatically, reflexive denial of something too terrible to accept. "Please, master, don't separate us. He's all I have left now. Rebecca is dead. Don't take Isaac too. I'll work twice as hard. I'll do anything. Just let me keep my son." Thornwood looked at him with something between amusement and contempt. "You're confused, Tobias. You don't have a son. I have property. Property that I own, that I can do with as I please. I can sell it when it's economically advantageous or when it's caused problems that need to be eliminated. Your boy, my property, caused problems. He stole. He triggered his mother's insubordination. He's demonstrated character defects that could spread to other children. So I'm eliminating the problem by selling him to a place where he'll either learn discipline or die trying. Either outcome is acceptable to me." "He's 9 years old," Tobias heard himself say, voice breaking. "Just a hungry child who took a piece of cornbread. You killed my wife for protecting him. Now you're sending him to die in Mississippi cotton fields. He won't survive. You know he won't survive." "That's not my concern," Thornwood said, taking a sip of bourbon. "My concern is maintaining discipline and order on my plantation. Your family has disrupted that order. I've dealt with the disruption. Now get back to your duties. The bees need tending, and I expect the November honey harvest to be excellent. Don't let your personal feelings interfere with your work, or you'll join your boy in Mississippi." Tobias left the study, walked back to his cabin, and stood in the doorway, looking at the space where Rebecca had died 20 hours earlier. The floor still showed bloodstains the women hadn't been able to clean completely. The air still smelled like herbs and death. And tomorrow his son would be taken away, sold to almost certain death in Mississippi Delta cotton fields, notorious for killing children within 2 years. Isaac was taken away on November 19th at dawn. Tobias held his son one last time, tried to be strong, tried to tell Isaac to remember his mother, to be brave, to survive somehow. Isaac clung to him, crying, begging, "Daddy, don't let them take me. Please, Daddy, I'll be good. I promise I'll be good. Please don't let them take me away." The trader, a hard man named Williams, who specialized in transporting enslaved children, physically pried Isaac's hands loose from Tobias's shirt, carried the screaming child to the wagon, dumped him inside with 4 other children. The wagon pulled away at 6:47 a.m. on November 19th, 1856. Tobias stood watching until it disappeared from sight, his son's face pressed against the wagon's slats, tears streaming down, mouth open in silent screaming. That was the last time Tobias Freeman saw his 9-year-old son, Isaac. 3 months later, in February 1857, Tobias would receive word through the enslaved communication network that Isaac had died from fever at the Riverside Plantation in Mississippi, having survived exactly 73 days in the cotton fields. He was buried in an unmarked grave. His death was recorded in Riverside's ledger as Negro boy Isaac, age 9, died from fever. Loss value, $450. In the span of 48 hours, Tobias Freeman had lost his entire family. Rebecca dead from beating, Isaac sold away. And within 3 months, Isaac would be dead too. And the man responsible for all of it, Robert Thornwood, faced 0 consequences. No trial, no punishment, no justice. Because under Texas law in 1856, enslaved people were property, and Thornwood had the absolute legal right to beat, sell, or kill his property, however he deemed appropriate. For 3 days after Isaac's departure, Tobias existed in a state of grief so profound that other enslaved people feared he would hang himself. He stopped eating, stopped speaking except in monosyllables, stopped maintaining his appearance. He worked mechanically, but with no awareness, moving through tasks like a dead man walking. Old Martha brought him food he didn't eat. The other men tried to offer comfort he couldn't hear. He was hollowed out, emptied of everything except pain. On the 4th day, November 22nd, 1856, something shifted. Tobias was working the beehives, performing routine maintenance, when he noticed fire ants swarming a dead mouse near one of the hives. Hundreds of ants, maybe thousands, coordinated perfectly, stripping the mouse's flesh in organized fashion. He watched them work and something clicked in his mind. They were tiny, individually powerless, but collectively, coordinated, directed toward a target, they were devastating. They could strip flesh from bone. They could kill things hundreds of times their size. They could swarm, overwhelm, destroy. And in that moment, watching fire ants work, Tobias understood what he would do. He would take the man who killed his wife and sold his son, and he would destroy something Thornwood loved with the same casual cruelty Thornwood had destroyed Tobias's family. And he would use the one weapon that white men never suspected: insects, coordinated, directed, weaponized through understanding of their behavior. It would take months. It would require patience measured in seasons. It would require sophisticated knowledge of entomology. But Tobias had time. He had knowledge, and he had absolutely nothing left to lose. The plan formed over weeks of careful thought and observation. Robert Thornwood had one daughter, Sarah, aged 23. His only living child after his wife had died in childbirth, with a second child in 1842. Thornwood doted on Sarah obsessively, all his emotional capacity focused on her. She was engaged to William Blackstone, heir to Blackstone Plantation, and their wedding was scheduled for June 14th, 1857, 7 months away. The wedding was to be the grandest social event Robertson County had ever seen. Thornwood was spending lavishly: French champagne, imported foods, a 5-tier wedding cake from New Orleans, decorations that cost more than a skilled enslaved person's value. The wedding represented everything Thornwood valued: wealth, status, social position, his daughter's happiness. Tobias decided he would destroy that wedding completely. Not through violence against Sarah herself. She had done nothing to earn vengeance, though she'd certainly benefited from the system that enabled her father's cruelty. But through chaos, through terror, through public humiliation that would devastate Thornwood more than physical pain. Through fire ants, millions of them, coordinated, trained, unleashed at the peak of celebration. It would require exceptional preparation. Breeding colonies to increase numbers, manipulating pheromones to direct movement, creating training patterns, timing everything perfectly. But Tobias had 7 months. and he had his father Marcus's knowledge of insects combined with his own 20 years of observation and study. The first challenge was understanding fire ant behavior at a level no one else had achieved. Tobias spent December 1856 studying existing colonies intensively. He documented everything: how they established trails, how they communicated through pheromones, how they responded to disturbances, what attracted them, what repelled them, how queens founded new colonies, how colonies interacted with each other. He filled his mind with data, built a mental model of fire ant behavior more detailed than anything written in scientific literature of the 1850s. Key insights emerged from this study. First, fire ants follow pheromone trails with extreme precision, capable of detecting trail chemicals at incredibly low concentrations. Second, disturbing a colony triggers aggressive defense response, sending thousands of workers out to investigate and attack threats. Third, newly mated queens establish colonies independently in spring-summer and can be relocated if handled carefully. Fourth, multiple colonies will avoid each other through territorial pheromones, but can be tricked into moving in parallel if trail markers are strong enough to override territorial avoidance. Fifth, fire ants are attracted to food sources and will mark trails to them, recruiting others through pheromone signals. Armed with these insights, Tobias began implementation in January 1857. Phase 1 was colony multiplication. He couldn't move established large colonies without being noticed, so he needed to create new colonies from queens he could collect during spring mating flights. Fire ants produce reproductive swarms in April-May in Texas. Tobias identified prime locations where mating flights would occur and prepared collection sites. But Robert Thornwood wasn't finished. The next morning, November 18th, he summoned Tobias to the main house. Tobias came, numb with grief, exhausted from sitting up all night with Rebecca's body. Thornwood was calm, almost pleasant. "About your boy," he said. "Isaac. He caused all this trouble. That cornbread theft, your wife's interference, the whole unfortunate situation. I've decided he's too much risk to keep here. I've sold him." Tobias's world stopped. "Sold him? Where?" "Mississippi. Cotton plantation. They needed children for lighter field work. Got a good price, $450. He leaves tomorrow." "Please," Tobias heard himself say. "Master, please, don't separate us. He's all I have left. I'll work harder, I'll do anything. Just let me keep my son." Thornwood looked at him with something like amusement. "You don't have a son, Tobias. I have property. Property I can sell when it's economically advantageous or when it's caused problems. Your boy caused problems. He's sold. Be grateful I'm keeping you, given how valuable your bee work is. Now get back to your duties." Isaac was taken away on November 19th, loaded onto a wagon with 4 other enslaved children being transported to Mississippi. Tobias held his son one last time, tried to be brave, tried to tell Isaac to be strong, to remember his mother, to survive. Isaac clung to him, crying, begging not to be taken away. The trader physically pried the child's hands loose, threw him into the wagon. The last thing Tobias saw was Isaac's face looking back as the wagon disappeared down the road. The same road Rebecca's body had been carried down the day before for burial in the slave cemetery. In the span of 48 hours, Tobias Freeman had lost his wife and son. Rebecca was dead. Isaac was sold to a plantation notorious for working children to death within 2 years. And the man responsible, Robert Thornwood, faced 0 consequences. No trial, no punishment, no justice. Because under Texas law, enslaved people were property, and Thornwood had the legal right to punish his property however he deemed appropriate, even if that punishment resulted in death. For 3 days, Tobias existed in a state of grief so profound that other enslaved people feared he would take his own life. He stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped working. On the fourth day, November 22nd, something changed. The grief was still there, would always be there. But it had crystallized into something colder, harder, more focused. A plan, a purpose, a way to make Robert Thornwood understand what loss felt like. Tobias understood that direct violence would accomplish nothing except his own death. He understood that any obvious revenge would be traced back to him immediately. But he also understood that Robert Thornwood had a daughter, Sarah, aged 23, his only child, whom he loved with the possessive intensity of a man who had lost his wife years earlier and had focused all his emotional capacity on his daughter. Sarah was engaged to William Blackstone, heir to a neighboring plantation, and their wedding was scheduled for June 14, 1857, 7 months away. The wedding was to be the grandest social event Robertson County had ever seen. With 340 invited guests, a massive reception, a demonstration of Thornwood's wealth and status. Tobias decided he would destroy that wedding. Not through violence against Sarah herself, she was relatively innocent, but through terror, through chaos, through public humiliation that would devastate Robert Thornwood more than physical pain ever could. And the weapon he would use was fire ants. Millions of them. Trained, directed, unleashed at the precise moment of celebration. It would require 14 months of patient preparation, would require sophisticated understanding of insect behavior, would require perfect timing. But Tobias had 14 months. He had knowledge, and he had absolutely nothing left to lose. The first challenge was scale. A single fire ant colony might contain 200,000 ants. To create true chaos at a reception with 340 guests spread across a large area, Tobias needed multiple colonies, ideally 10 to 20, totaling 3 to 5 million ants. But fire ant colonies are territorial and will fight each other. So Tobias needed to create a situation where multiple colonies would cooperate, or at least move in parallel toward the same target. The solution was pheromone manipulation. Fire ants communicate primarily through chemical signals, pheromones that indicate food sources, danger, trails to follow. Tobias couldn't synthesize these chemicals, but he could collect them and concentrate them. Fire ants lay trail pheromones from their venom gland when moving between nest and food source. If Tobias could mark a specific location with concentrated trail pheromone from multiple colonies, he could potentially direct multiple colonies toward that location simultaneously, each colony following its own chemical signals. Starting in December 1856, 1 month after Rebecca's death, Tobias began collecting fire ant colonies. He couldn't move entire established colonies. That would be too obvious and too difficult. Instead, he collected queens. Fire ant colonies are founded by mated queens who establish new nests. In spring and summer, fire ants produce winged reproductive ants that swarm, mate, and then the fertilized queens search for nesting sites. Tobias waited until spring 1857 when mating flights occurred, then collected 23 newly mated queens from various locations across the plantation grounds. He established these queens in artificial nesting sites he created in a remote corner of the plantation's wooded area, 600 yards from the main buildings, in a section that was rarely visited because it was considered useless scrubland. Each queen was given a separate mound built from loose soil, with starter chambers dug carefully, provided with initial food sources. 18 of the 23 queens successfully established colonies. Within 6 months, by June 1857, these colonies ranged from 50,000 to 180,000 ants each, totaling approximately 1.8 million ants under Tobias's management. But Tobias needed more. He identified 5 large natural fire ant colonies on the plantation periphery and mapped their territories carefully. These colonies contained 200,000 400,000 ants each, totaling approximately 1.5 million additional ants. Combined with his cultivated colonies, Tobias had access to roughly 3.3 million fire ants across 23 separate colonies, enough to overwhelm any human gathering if he could direct them properly. The second challenge was direction. Fire ants would follow pheromone trails, but Tobias needed them to converge on the wedding reception specifically, not random locations. He needed to create concentrated pheromone markers at the reception site and establish training patterns months in advance so the colonies would respond predictably when released. Tobias's solution was brilliant and required extraordinary patience. Starting in February 1857, 4 months before the wedding, he began placing food sources in a specific pattern. Small amounts of sugar water and protein, crushed insects, arranged in lines extending from each colony's location toward a central convergence point. He marked these lines with pheromone extract he collected by crushing ants and dissolving their venom sacs in water, creating a crude but functional trail marker. Every 3 days, Tobias would refresh the trails and food sources, training the colonies to associate the marked paths with food. The colonies began following the trails regularly, establishing them as familiar foraging routes. Over 4 months, February through May, the colonies learned that these specific trails led to reliable food sources. They weren't trained like Pavlov's dogs, exactly, but they were behaviorally conditioned through consistent reward. The third challenge was timing. The wedding reception was scheduled for June 14, 1857, beginning at 2 p.m. Tobias needed the ants to arrive at the peak of celebration, approximately 3:30 and 4 p.m., when all guests would be present. Food would be served, toasts would be made. Fire ants are most active during warm afternoons, so timing was favorable. But he needed to ensure they would all move simultaneously, would all arrive within minutes of each other, to create overwhelming numbers before people could react effectively. Tobias's solution involved trigger mechanisms. He would place extremely concentrated pheromone markers and fresh food sources at the reception site on the morning of the wedding, creating irresistible attraction. Then, at approximately 3 p.m., he would disturb the colonies simultaneously by poking each mound with a stick, which triggers aggressive response and mass mobilization. Disturbed colonies would send out workers to investigate and defend, and those workers would immediately detect the strong pheromone trails leading toward the reception site. With all 23 colonies disturbed simultaneously and all detecting attractive pheromone signals in the same direction, they would mobilize en masse. The fourth challenge was pheromone collection and concentration. To create markers strong enough to attract millions of ants, Tobias needed concentrated pheromone extract. From February through early June, he collected fire ants by the thousands, carefully crushing them and extracting the contents of their venom glands into small vials of alcohol, creating a concentrated solution. This was dangerous work. He was stung hundreds of times, but his tolerance increased over months of repeated exposure. By early June, Tobias had collected approximately 80 milliliters of concentrated pheromone extract, enough to create powerful markers at the reception site. The extract smelled faintly sweet and chemical, but not strongly enough that humans would notice it among other scents at an outdoor reception. The fifth challenge was placement. Tobias needed to mark the reception site without being noticed. He couldn't do it on the day of the wedding. Too much activity and supervision. He did it 3 days before, on June 11th, when the reception tent was being erected but workers were focused on construction. Tobias volunteered to help with setup, offering his services as someone familiar with the grounds, someone who could advise on insect control, ironically. While others worked on the tent structure, Tobias moved through the area with small vials of pheromone extract, marking strategic locations. Table legs, chair supports, Tent poles, the area where the wedding cake would stand, the perimeter of the tent. He used a small brush to apply the extract, just tiny amounts, virtually invisible but chemically powerful. He also buried small containers of sugar water, mixed with pheromone extract at key points around the tent perimeter, creating attraction nodes that would concentrate ant activity. On June 13th, the day before the wedding, Tobias conducted final preparations. He refreshed the pheromone trails leading from all 23 colonies toward the reception site. He placed additional food sources along the trails to reinforce the routes. He verified that all colonies were healthy, active, and ready to mobilize. Everything was prepared. Now he just had to wait for June 14th and execute the final trigger. June 14th, 1857 dawned clear and hot, temperature reaching 87 degrees Celsius by noon, perfect conditions for fire ant activity. The wedding ceremony was held at 1 p.m. in the plantation's chapel. 340 guests attended, the elite of Robertson County and beyond. Plantation owners, judges, merchants, politicians, their wives and families. It was a display of wealth and power, exactly the kind of event Robert Thornwood loved, exactly the kind of celebration Tobias intended to destroy. At 2 p.m., guests moved to the reception tent on the south lawn. The tent was enormous. White canvas stretched over wooden poles, decorated with flowers and ribbons. Inside were 20 long tables covered in white linen, place settings with fine china and crystal, centerpieces of roses and magnolias. The wedding feast included roasted meats, fresh vegetables, imported cheeses, pastries, wedding cake 5 tiers high, champagne, and wine. It represented months of preparation and thousands of dollars in expense. Tobias watched from a distance, positioned near the beehive area where his presence was normal and unremarkable. He could see the reception tent, could hear the music and laughter, could see Robert Thornwood beaming with pride as he played the role of generous host. At 3 p.m. exactly, Tobias began walking toward the wooded area where the fire ant colonies were located. It took him 15 minutes to reach all 23 colony sites. At each one, he used a long stick to poke and disturb the mound, then immediately moved to the next colony. Fire ants respond to nest disturbance within seconds, mobilizing workers to defend and investigate. By 3:20 p.m., all 23 colonies had been disturbed, and millions of ants were beginning to emerge, detecting the pheromone trails that led toward the reception tent. Fire ants move at approximately 3 to 4 meters per minute when following pheromone trails. The colonies were 200 to 600 yards from the reception tent. This meant arrival times would vary from 15 to 30 minutes after disturbance. Tobias had calculated that the first ants would arrive around 3:35 p.m., with peak arrival around 3:45 p.m. He returned to his observation position and waited. At 3:37 p.m., the first fire ants reached the tent perimeter. Scouts following the strongest pheromone trails arrived first, detected the markers Tobias had placed, and immediately began recruiting. Fire ants recruit through pheromone signals, essentially saying, "Food here, come quickly." Within 3 minutes, hundreds of ants were arriving, following trails that led directly to table legs, chairs, and food areas. At 3:42 p.m., the first guest noticed ants on the table. A woman screamed. Others looked down and saw ants climbing table legs, swarming across a white tablecloths toward food. People stood up, brushed ants away. But more were arriving every second, thousands now, following multiple trails from multiple colonies. By 3:45 p.m., the situation had gone from concerning to catastrophic. The wedding toast was scheduled for 3:47 p.m. Robert Thornwood stood, raised his glass, began speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I may have your attention. Today we celebrate not just the union of my daughter Sarah and William Blackstone, but the joining of 2 great families, 2 great plantations, 2..." He stopped mid-sentence, because fire ants were now visible everywhere, covering the tables, climbing up guests' legs, emerging from the wedding cake, swarming across the white tent canvas. People were screaming, swatting frantically, discovering that fire ants were already inside their clothing, on their skin, biting repeatedly. The burning pain was immediate and overwhelming. What happened next was pure chaos, documented by numerous witnesses whose testimony was collected in the days following the disaster. 340 people in formal clothing, many of them elderly or unaccustomed to physical activity, panicked simultaneously in a confined space. The result was stampede, injury, and death on a scale no one had anticipated. Mrs. Caroline Whitfield, age 71, was sitting at table 3 when fire ants began swarming her legs. She stood up quickly, lost her balance, fell backward. Her head struck the edge of a chair. She was trampled by 3 people fleeing blindly. When helpers reached her 2 minutes later, she had 47 ant stings and a severe head injury. She went into anaphylactic shock at 4:05 p.m., her throat swelling closed, her blood pressure dropping catastrophically. Despite attempts to treat her with cold compresses and elevation, she died at 4:23 p.m., 18 minutes after the shock began, unable to breathe as her airways closed completely. Judge Marcus Rutherford, age 68, had a pre-existing heart condition. When ants swarmed the cake table where he was standing, he panicked and ran toward the tent exit. Fire ants were crawling up his legs, inside his trousers, biting repeatedly. The pain and terror triggered cardiac arrhythmia. He collapsed at 4:12 p.m., clutching his chest. His wife Catherine tried to help him, but ants were covering both of them. Other guests tried to reach him, but couldn't get through the chaos. He died at 4:31 p.m. from massive myocardial infarction, his heart unable to handle the stress of pain, panic, and venom. Reverend Thomas Hampton, age 73, attempted to calm people by shouting, "Remain calm, God will protect us," while ants covered him. He received approximately 230 stings in the first 3 minutes because he stayed still, trying to set an example of faith and composure. The massive venom dose triggered severe allergic reaction despite having no prior ant allergy. His face swelled grotesquely. His breathing became labored. He collapsed at 4:18 p.m., conscious but unable to speak as his throat closed. He died at 4:47 p.m., suffocating slowly while other guests watched helplessly, his faith insufficient to save him from biology. Margaret Blackstone, age 69, the groom's grandmother, was sitting in a chair when ants swarmed her. She was too frail to stand quickly or run. By the time family members reached her, ants had crawled up under her dress and were biting her extensively on her lower body. She received approximately 180 stings before they could remove her clothing and brush the ants away. The cumulative venom triggered both anaphylaxis and cardiac event. She lost consciousness at 4:25 p.m. and died at 5:03 p.m., despite being attended by a physician who had been among the guests. But the 4 deaths were just the most dramatic outcomes. The injuries were widespread and severe. Sarah Thornwood, the bride, was standing near the wedding cake when it collapsed under the weight of fire ants, undermining its structure. She was covered in cake, frosting, and approximately 200 fire ants in seconds. She screamed and tried to remove them, but ants were inside her wedding dress, an elaborate white silk gown with multiple layers that trapped ants against her skin. It took 3 women 5 minutes to get the dress off, while Sarah screamed continuously. She received 143 stings across her torso, arms, neck, and face. 7 stings were on her lips. Multiple stings hit her right cheek, causing permanent scarring. She lost consciousness from shock and pain at 3:52 p.m. William Blackstone, the groom, rushed to help Sarah and was himself swarmed. Ants covered his formal suit, a black wool outfit that held ants against his skin. He received 97 stings while trying to reach his bride. Most devastatingly, several ants crawled across his face and stung his left eyelid repeatedly. 6 stings on the eyelid itself. The venom caused immediate massive swelling. His eye was forced shut by the swelling and remained closed for 3 weeks. When it finally opened, his vision was permanently impaired. He would never regain full sight in that eye, spending the rest of his life with blurred peripheral vision on the left side. Dozens of other guests sustained serious injuries. Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison, age 45, broke her wrist falling while trying to flee. Mr. Charles Bradford, age 52, dislocated his shoulder being trampled. 6 children between ages 5 to 12 received over 100 stings each, causing weeks of painful pustules and infection. 3 pregnant women went into premature labor from the stress and venom, though all 3 babies ultimately survived after difficult deliveries. The physical destruction matched the human casualties. The wedding feast was completely annihilated. Every piece of food was contaminated with ants. The roasted pig, ants covering every surface. The imported cheeses, ants tunneling through. The fresh vegetables, ants swarming the bowls. The pastries, ants inside and out. The 5-tier wedding cake, collapsed and covered. The champagne was undrinkable. Bottles had been knocked over, glasses shattered, liquid mixed with ants. The wine barrels showed ants climbing inside through bung holes, contaminating the contents. The property damage exceeded $4,000 in 1857 dollars, approximately $120,000 in modern value. 22 tables were overturned or broken. 173 chairs were damaged or destroyed. 47 place settings of fine china were shattered. 81 crystal glasses were broken. The tent canvas was torn in multiple places as people cut through it to escape. Decorations, hundreds of dollars of imported ribbons, flowers, and silk, were destroyed. The hardwood dance floor that had been specially installed was covered in trampled food and broken glass. By 4:30 p.m., the reception area was abandoned. Not a single guest remained in the tent. The only living things present were fire ants, millions of them, crawling over every surface, swarming the destroyed feast, exploring the overturned furniture. The elegant white tent looked like a battlefield, covered in debris and destruction. Robert Thornwood stood 50 yards away, watching his daughter's wedding reception in ruins, watching guests being treated for injuries, watching coffins being prepared for 4 dead guests. And something inside him broke. He'd spent $8,000 on this wedding, 18 months planning it, envisioned it as his crowning social achievement. Now it was the worst disaster in county history. His daughter was scarred. His new son-in-law was partially blinded. 4 people were dead. His reputation was destroyed. And he had no idea how it had happened, no one to blame except nature, no way to restore what had been lost. Tobias watched from his position 400 yards away near the Beehive area until 5:10 p.m., until the last injured guest had been carried away, until the bodies of the 4 dead had been moved, until the tent stood empty except for ants. Then he calmly returned to his normal duties. When questioned later by overseers about the ant attack, he expressed appropriate shock and concern. He suggested the hot weather might have caused multiple colonies to swarm simultaneously. He noted that fire ants can be unpredictable, that massive coordinated movements occasionally happen in nature. He offered to help clean up and implement new ant control measures. His performance was perfect. Helpful, knowledgeable, but not suspiciously so. Sympathetic, but not overly emotional. No one suspected him, because who would suspect an enslaved man could breed and direct millions of insects? Some guests tried to flee to their carriages, but Tobias had marked those too with pheromone trails. Ants were already swarming the carriage area. Others ran to the ornamental pond thinking water would help. But Tobias had anticipated that. He'd placed pheromone markers around the pond perimeter. Ants surrounded the water. People who dove in came out covered in even more ants. The bride Sarah Thornwood collapsed at 3:52 p.m., having been stung 143 times in a 5-minute period. Multiple stings had hit her face, neck, and arms. She was in shock from pain and anaphylactic reaction. Medical assistance was summoned, but took time to arrive. William Blackstone, trying to help his bride, was himself swarmed and stung 97 times. Several ants crawled across his face and stung his left eyelid repeatedly, causing immediate swelling and eventual permanent vision impairment. 4 elderly guests with underlying heart conditions experienced severe anaphylactic reactions and cardiac events between 4:05 p.m. and 4:30 p.m. Caroline Whitfield, age 71, went into anaphylactic shock at 4:05 p.m. and died at 4:23 p.m. despite attempts at treatment. Judge Marcus Rutherford, age 68, suffered cardiac arrest at 4:12 p.m. and died at 4:31 p.m. Reverend Thomas Hampton, age 73, collapsed at 4:18 p.m. and died at 4:47 p.m. Margaret Blackstone, age 69, the groom's grandmother, went into shock at 4:25 p.m. and died at 5:03 p.m. By 4:30 p.m., the reception area was abandoned. The tent was covered in fire ants. The wedding feast was completely destroyed, every piece of food contaminated. The wedding cake had collapsed as ants undermined its structure. Crystal glasses had been knocked over and shattered. Tables were overturned. The elegant white tent looked like a disaster zone. Tobias watched from his distant position until 5:00 p.m., then calmly returned to the beehive area and resumed his normal work. When questioned later about the ant attack, he expressed shock and concern, suggested the unusually hot weather must have caused multiple colonies to swarm simultaneously, noted that fire ants can be unpredictable. He offered to help clean up and implement new ant control measures. His performance was perfect. Helpful, concerned, knowledgeable, but not suspiciously so. The investigation began the next day. A naturalist from Austin was brought in to examine the site. He found evidence of massive fire ant activity. Estimated 3 to 4 million ants had been involved based on damage patterns. He noted unusual concentration of ant trails leading toward specific areas. He observed that multiple colonies appeared to have moved in coordinated fashion, which was odd, but not impossible. His conclusion: unprecedented natural swarm event, possibly triggered by weather conditions and colony maturation cycles. Multiple colonies reached foraging relocation stage simultaneously and were attracted to food sources at reception. While highly unusual, this appears to be a natural phenomenon rather than deliberate action. But one person suspected otherwise. The plantation's head overseer, a man named Crawford, who had restrained Tobias during Rebecca's beating, noticed that Tobias had been conducting unusual activities in the wooded areas for months. He reported his suspicions to Robert Thornwood. Thornwood had Tobias questioned but found no evidence, no tools for moving ants, no documented testimony about suspicious behavior. Nothing concrete, just suspicion. And Tobias maintained perfect composure throughout questioning, expressed horror at the tragedy, offered suggestions for preventing future incidents. He was too valuable to punish without proof. The wedding disaster destroyed Robert Thornwood financially and socially. The deaths of 4 prominent guests created scandal. The injuries to his daughter and new son-in-law generated lawsuits. The humiliation was total and public. Within a year, Thornwood had sold portions of his plantation to cover debts. His daughter Sarah was permanently scarred, both physically and psychologically. His reputation never recovered. Tobias Freeman continued working at Thornwood Plantation until 1862, when Union forces reached the area and he walked away a free man. He moved to Houston, worked as a beekeeper and pest control specialist, lived until 1889, dying at age 70. He never spoke publicly about June 14, 1857. But before his death, he told his second wife privately, "I didn't kill Rebecca. I didn't sell Isaac. But I made the man who did those things understand what loss feels like. Made him watch his daughter's perfect day become nightmare. Made him feel helpless to stop it. Made him know that even the powerless have ways to fight back if they understand nature's weapons." The story of the fire ant general spread through Texas's black communities, told in whispers, passed down through generations. The man who bred millions of ants and trained them like soldiers. The father who avenged his wife's murder and son's sale using insects that white people didn't understand. The proof that intelligence and patience could defeat brutality, that nature itself could be weaponized against oppression. Modern entomologists who've studied the case are split on feasibility. Dr. Sarah Morrison, Texas A&M professor specializing in social insects, published analysis in 2012. Pheromone manipulation of fire ants is theoretically possible, but extraordinarily difficult. Creating artificial trail pheromones through crude extraction might work at small scale. Directing millions of ants from multiple colonies simultaneously would require both sophisticated understanding of ant behavior and perfect timing. If Tobias Freeman achieved this with 1850s technology and knowledge, he demonstrated entomological expertise comparable to trained scientists. Whether the wedding disaster was deliberate or coincidental natural swarm, it's remarkable. The moral questions remain complex. Tobias killed 4 people indirectly, injured hundreds, traumatized countless others, including relatively innocent people like Sarah Thornwood, who had nothing to do with Rebecca's death or Isaac's sale. But he operated in a system where his wife could be beaten to death for protecting their child, where his 9-year-old son could be sold away, where he had zero legal recourse, where justice as white society defined it was categorically unavailable. Was he justified? That depends on whether you believe fathers whose wives are murdered and children are sold have the right to exact revenge through any means available. Was he brilliant? Unquestionably. He understood insect behavior at a level that few people in 1857 could match, and he used that knowledge to create a weapon that no one suspected existed. Remember his name, Tobias Freeman, born enslaved 1819, died free 1889, beekeeper, entomologist, father and husband, destroyer of weddings. The man who proved that fire ants could be directed like weapons, that pheromones could be manipulated to control millions of insects, that nature's smallest creatures could be turned against oppressors if you understood their language. 3 million fire ants, 1 wedding, 4 dead, 340 injured. Perfect revenge through perfect knowledge of nature's weapons.